We signed the deed with a smile that morning, thinking we were passing our legacy into safe hands. The sun was soft on the fields, the fence line glowing like an old promise. He hugged us, told us he'd take care of everything. 2 months later, he married a woman half his age, packed his truck, and vanished down our dirt road like we were strangers. That was the moment I realized trust can be stolen the same way land can. Quiet, clean, without warning. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. I still remember how the morning looked the day we signed the deed. The farm had that warm, lived-in glow you only see after decades of sweat and prayer. Dew sat on the grass like tiny pearls. The old barn leaned the same way it always had, stubborn but proud. My husband, Ray, kept patting my shoulder like he was reassuring himself as much as me. We'd worked that land for 43 years, raised 2 daughters, buried 1 dog, lost 3 barns to storms, rebuilt each one. That farm was our heartbeat. So when our nephew Daniel offered to take it over, it felt like an answered prayer. Our daughters lived in the city and had no interest in farming. We didn't want to sell to a corporation. We wanted someone with our blood to walk those rows and keep the place alive. Daniel had grown up helping us in summers. He knew every corner of that land. He called me Aunt May in a way that made me feel safe. That meant something. He came to our porch that morning with 2 coffees, smiling like a boy, though he was 37. He said things like, "You two deserve rest," and "I'll honor everything you built." I believed him. Of course I believed him. Sometimes family can lie without blinking, but you don't see it until the wind changes. Ray and I sat at the kitchen table, the deed paper between us. It felt heavier than it looked. I had this tiny shiver inside my chest, like something was trying to warn me, but I brushed it away. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself love is supposed to mean trust. So we signed. Right after, Daniel hugged us both. His arms were tight and warm. He said, "You'll always have a home here." I didn't know that promise had an expiration date. For a few weeks, everything felt normal. He drove the tractor, he checked the fences, he brought us tomatoes from the garden. He even said grace with us one evening. I held on to those moments later, turning them over in my mind like proof that he wasn't always planning something dark. Then one day, he started dressing different. Fancy boots, big belt buckles, new shirts that didn't look like they'd ever seen dirt. I asked where he was going all the time, and he laughed it off. "Just town," he said. "New friends." A week later, he brought her home. Her name was Crystal, 24, long blonde hair, sharp little voice, the kind of smile that has no warmth in it. She barely looked at me. She didn't ask about the farm. She didn't ask about our family history. She walked around the kitchen like she owned it after 10 minutes. That night, when they drove away, Ray said, "Something's off." I nodded, but I didn't want to believe it yet. 2 months after we signed the deed, Daniel told us he was getting married. The wedding was quick, no family invited, not even us. They disappeared for a weekend and came back with matching rings. His whole personality had shifted. Loud, impatient, money-hungry in a way I'd never seen. He kept talking about investments and flipping the land, words that made me cold. Then, one morning, we woke up to the sound of a truck engine. I peeked out the window and saw Daniel loading boxes. Crystal stood beside him, sunglasses on, though it was barely light outside. She laughed at something he said, then he slammed the truck door, and the sound felt like the closing of something bigger. He didn't come inside. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even look toward the house. The truck rolled down our dirt road and disappeared into the trees. That was it. The boy who used to eat cornbread in my kitchen vanished like smoke. Hours later, the phone rang. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Turner. Her voice shook. "May, honey, "Did you know your farm is listed online? It's for sale." My heart dropped so fast I had to grab the counter to steady myself. I tried to answer, but nothing came out. My mouth just hung open, like my words had run off too. Ray walked in, saw my face, and went pale. When I handed him the phone, he listened for 5 seconds, then closed his eyes like someone had hit him. He didn't speak for a long time. He just sat at the table with his hands folded, staring at the wall. A storm moved in that evening. The sky turned dark and heavy. Rain hit the windows in sharp little bursts. The whole house felt crowded with silence. I kept thinking about that signature on the deed, how quick it was, how final, how we'd smiled like fools while handing over our life's work. In every corner of that night, I kept hearing one thought whispering through me. We didn't just lose land, we lost our trust, and that can break an old heart in ways you don't expect. But something else stirred inside me too, something I hadn't felt in years. A small, steady fire. A voice that said, "Not yet. Not like this. Fight." I didn't know then how deep the betrayal would go. I didn't know there were forged signatures and hidden receipts waiting to surface. I didn't know that neighbors had seen things we hadn't. And I didn't know how far Daniel was willing to go to keep what wasn't his. But that night, with the storm shaking the windows, I made a promise to myself. I would get our land back, even if it meant tearing open every lie he'd wrapped around us. And that was how the battle began. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the yard soaked and shining under a thin fleece of sunlight. The air smelled like wet soil and pine needles, the kind of scent that usually brought me peace, but that day it only made my stomach twist tighter. I walked out to the porch with my coffee and stared at the fields. They looked tired, almost bruised in the gray light. Maybe it was just my own heart reflecting back at me. Ray came out a few minutes later. He didn't say much. He rarely did when he was carrying something heavy. He sat beside me, rubbed his hands together, and stared out at the same fields I was looking at. 43 years of sweat. 43 years of frostbitten fingers, harvest celebrations, late nights fixing machinery by flashlight. All of it suddenly in someone else's hands, someone who didn't care. I finally broke the silence. "We need to go to the courthouse." He nodded slowly. "We do." It felt strange getting dressed like we were preparing for a funeral, but in a way that's what it was. A funeral for trust, for family, for the life we thought we'd pass down gently, not have ripped away like an old bandage. The courthouse in Willow Creek is small, the kind of place where time doesn't hurry. The floors creak, the windows are always fogged, and the front desk smells like old paper. We walked in holding hands, something we hadn't done in years. That told me how scared he was. A clerk named Martha sat behind the counter, glasses low on her nose. She'd known us for decades. I saw her face soften the moment she recognized us. "Aunt May? What's wrong?" I swallowed hard. "Can you pull up the deed transfer on our farm, the one we signed for Daniel?" She hesitated, like she already knew this wasn't going to be good. Then she typed something into her computer, squinting at the screen. After a moment, she exhaled. "It was filed. Everything looks official." She paused, tapping the screen. "But there's something strange. The signature page was scanned twice, 2 versions." Ray and I looked at each other. "2 versions?" I asked. She nodded. "One with your signatures, one without." I felt the back of my neck warm. "Why would there be one without?" Martha shook her head. "That's unusual. Usually drafts are destroyed. Only the signed final gets filed." She clicked again. "But Daniel's lawyer uploaded both." "Daniel has a lawyer?" I whispered. Ray's jaw tightened. "Why would he need one for family business?" Martha leaned back, her voice low. "Do you mind if I print these for you?" I nodded. My hands trembled as I took the papers from her. Page 1, our signatures. Page 2, a clean copy. No signatures at all. It looked new, crisp, like someone had printed it just days ago. Ray leaned over my shoulder. His voice was soft but heavy. "May, you don't think—" I did. Oh, I did, but I didn't want to say it yet. Saying it made it real. We thanked Martha and walked outside. The sky had cleared, but in my chest a storm was still swirling. Ray put the papers in the truck console, shut it slowly, and turned to me. "We need help," he said. I nodded. "We do." We drove to see an old friend, Earl, a retired real estate agent who lived a mile down the road. Earl was the kind of man who knew everything about land in Willow Creek. If someone sold even half an acre, he knew before the ink dried. He answered the door wearing his usual flannel and suspenders. His beard had gone white in the last few years. He looked at us, surprised. "Well, if it ain't two ghosts on my porch, come on in." We sat at his kitchen table, the wood scratched from years of card games and coffee cups. Ray explained everything. The deed transfer, Daniel's disappearance, the online listing, the two versions of the deed. Earl didn't interrupt once. When Ray finished, Earl leaned back and rubbed his face. "This is bad," he said quietly. I felt something cold move through me. "He's got your signed deed, so legally he owns the land. But listing it this fast, that's a red flag." He tapped the table. "And the second version of the deed, the clean one? That's worse. That means someone wanted a version ready to alter or attach something else to." "Like what?" I whispered. "A forged signature," he said. I felt Ray's jaw tighten beside me. He wouldn't, but his voice didn't have any strength in it. "He already did," I said softly. Earl leaned forward. "There's something else. A few people in town told me they saw Daniel talking to that developer from Pine Ridge, the one who's been buying up farmland, the one who doesn't care who he pushes out." My heart dropped. "A developer?" Earl nodded. "If Daniel sells to him, you'll never see that farm again. He tears down barns like they're weeds." The words hit like a hammer. I felt old and small for a moment, but something inside me pushed back. A quiet, stubborn fire. "Earl," I said, my voice shaking but steady, "what can we do?" He slid a legal pad toward me. "Start gathering everything you have, every receipt that proves you paid taxes, every document that shows you maintained the land, every neighbor who saw you working after the transfer, anything that proves he didn't truly take possession." "Why does that matter?" Ray asked. "Because in cases of bad faith transfer, judges look at intent. If he manipulated you for financial gain, you might have a case to reverse it." I swallowed. "A case to get the farm back?" "Yes," Earl said. "But you need evidence, not feelings, not memories, paper." My breath trembled out. "We have receipts going back decades." Earl nodded slowly. "Then you're not out of the fight yet." We left his house with a list of things to gather. When we got home, Ray went to the shed and I went to the old cedar chest in the guest room. The chest smelled of lavender and dust, and for a moment it made my eyes sting. Inside were folders, envelopes, little calendar books where I wrote down every harvest, every crop rotation, every storm damage we repaired ourselves. I set the papers on the bed, forming piles. Taxes, utilities, equipment repairs, crop sales, every year, every season, every proof that the land was ours in spirit, even if the paper now said otherwise. I felt something growing inside me as I worked. Not anger, not bitterness, something steadier, something older, a quiet strength. This wasn't just land. This wasn't just betrayal. This was our life. And no matter how young his wife was, no matter how shiny her smile looked when she drove away with him, I wasn't losing without a fight. Not this time. Not this land. Not this heart. Ray and I spent the next morning buried in paperwork. The kitchen table disappeared under piles of old folders, receipts, tax statements, and handwritten notes going back farther than I could remember. Some of the papers were yellow around the edges. Some had coffee stains. Some were wrinkled from the times I shoved them into my apron after a long day in the fields. Those pages weren't just records. They were pieces of our lives, proof of every season we survived. Ray sat across from me, reading through a stack with his glasses pushed low on his nose. Every so often, he mumbled something, mostly small memories. I fixed that fence in April, or that was the year the storm took the west roof. They felt like reminders, little anchors pulling us back to ourselves. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Ray froze. I felt my breath catch. We weren't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, our neighbor, Mrs. Turner, stood there holding a folder. Her gray hair was penned neatly, but her eyes looked worried. She stepped inside without waiting for me to invite her. That alone told me something was wrong. "May," she said quietly, "I thought you should see this." She opened the folder and pulled out a printed screenshot. It was our farm listing, the one Daniel posted online. But this one showed something new, a red label, "Sale Pending." My knees wobbled. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "He accepted an offer," she whispered. The words felt like a punch. Ray went pale. "When?" she said. "Last night," she said. "My nephew works for the real estate office in town. He saw the update and called me first thing." I stared at the page. It didn't feel real. I traced the words with my finger, slow and stunned. Sale pending. 2 words. 2 little words that held the power to uproot everything. "He can't do this," Ray said, but he didn't sound convinced. He sounded like a man trying to hold on to something slipping fast. Mrs. Turner reached into the folder again. "There's more. My nephew printed the buyer information. It's not just any developer." She hesitated. "It's Whitlock." I felt my stomach tighten. Whitlock Enterprises, the developer known for swallowing farmland across 3 counties. They turned family plots into storage facilities, truck yards, and vacation cabins. They didn't care about heritage or history or heart. They cared about profit. Every time I saw their logo, I felt a flash of dread. Now it stood inches from our past. Ray whispered, "We can't let him sell to them." No, we couldn't. This wasn't just losing a farm. This was erasing everything we had built. Every memory, every season, every seed we planted. They would flatten it in a week, bulldoze the soil like it meant nothing. Mrs. Turner placed a gentle hand on my arm. "I'm so sorry, May," she said. I nodded, though my voice was trapped in my throat. She left a moment later, leaving us alone with the quiet hum of fear growing thick around us. Ray sat down heavily, rubbing his forehead. "We need a lawyer, but lawyers cost money, a lot of money, and retired farmers don't have deep pockets." I looked around our small kitchen, imagining selling things, downsizing, losing more just to fight for the place we'd already lost once. But something inside me snapped. Softly, quietly, but enough to make my heart change direction. "We're not backing down," I said. Ray looked up. "May," he said. "No," I said. "I mean it. We're not backing down. We're not rolling over for this boy. We raised him, we fed him, we taught him, we trusted him, and he threw us away." My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. "We'll find a way." Ray nodded slowly, like a man remembering his backbone. We spent the next 2 hours calling lawyers across the county. Some were too expensive, some were too busy, some didn't want to take on a case against Whitlock, which told me just how powerful they were. Then we reached a man named Harlan Beck, older, retired once, came back part-time, known for fighting land disputes. He agreed to review our documents if we came in that afternoon. We drove to his office, a small brick building on the corner of Main Street. Inside, it smelled like old books and tobacco. Harlan sat behind a cluttered desk, white hair wild around his ears, glasses crooked. He looked like someone who had seen enough of life to know when something smelled rotten. He invited us to sit. I handed him the folder of documents. My hands shook a bit, but he didn't seem to mind. He started flipping through them, his finger tapping the edges of each paper. He took his time. 15 minutes passed, then 20. He didn't speak, didn't even look up. Finally, he placed both hands flat on the table. "You're in trouble," he said plainly. I felt the room tilt. Ray leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Harlan pointed to the printed screenshot. "He's already accepted an offer. If that deal closes, reversing it will be nearly impossible." "But we were manipulated," I said. "We didn't understand what he planned. He betrayed us." Harlan nodded. "I know, but the law moves on paper, not feelings." He tapped a tax receipt from last year. "This helps you. It shows continued ownership responsibility." He slid over a calendar book showing crop schedules. "This helps too, shows occupation, maintenance." Then he lifted the clean, unsigned deed version. "And this is your best chance." I leaned in. "How?" "Two versions," he said. "That's sloppy. That means someone prepared documents for multiple purposes. It could indicate fraud or intent to deceive." "Can we stop the sale?" Ray asked. "Maybe," Harlan said, "but you need something stronger, something that shows he acted in bad faith, something that ties him to the developer before the deed transfer." My heart thudded. "Like what?" "A witness," he said. "Someone who saw him meeting Whitlock or his agents before the deed transfer. Or any document, text, email, anything that shows he planned to sell before he convinced you to sign." I felt a flicker of hope, the kind of hope that hurts a little because it's small and delicate. We drove home after the meeting, both of us silent. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields. I watched them stretch out, trying not to imagine bulldozers rolling through them. As we pulled into our driveway, we saw a truck parked near the back fence, a dark blue pickup. I recognized it instantly. It was Mr. Thompson's truck, our neighbor who lived on the hill, a man who rarely came down our way unless he had a reason. He stood near the fence, arms crossed, watching us pull in. When Ray stepped out of the truck, Mr. Thompson walked towards us with a slow, heavy stride. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Ray replied, wary. Mr. Thompson looked at me, then he looked back at the house, the fields, the barn. Finally, he let out a breath. "I need to tell you something, and it ain't good." My heart thumped. "What is it?" I asked. He rubbed his jaw. "I saw Daniel about a month before you signed the deed." I stiffened. "He was talking to someone from Whitlock, man in a suit. They were walking your property line, laughing, pointing at things, talking numbers." My breath left my body in one slow rush. Mr. Thompson lowered his voice. "He planned this long before he asked you to sign." The wind moved through the trees, soft but cold. Ray whispered, "Can you swear to that?" Mr. Thompson looked me straight in the eye. "I can swear it in church, court, and at my own funeral." Something warm and fierce rose inside me. A witness, a strong one, a good man, a neighbor who saw everything. We weren't powerless anymore. We finally had something real, something sharp, something that could cut through the lies Daniel wrapped around us. All at once, I felt the ground under me steady again. For the first time since this nightmare began, hope didn't feel delicate. It felt strong, and it felt ready. Mr. Thompson's words followed me into the house like a shadow. I could still hear the steady way he said it, the certainty in his voice. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't repeating gossip. He saw it with his own eyes. That meant Daniel's betrayal didn't happen in one bad moment. It was planted long before we even understood the danger. It grew quietly behind our backs, like a weed hidden in tall grass. Ray closed the door behind us and leaned his palm against it. He looked older than he had yesterday. His shoulders sagged, his breath came slow. "He walked our fence line with a developer," he whispered. "Our fence line." I held on to the edge of the kitchen counter to steady myself. "He used our trust like a tool." Ray shook his head. No, like a weapon. We stood there for a moment, letting those words settle between us. Sometimes the truth doesn't fall like a stone. Sometimes it spreads like cold water, soaking you slowly until you feel it in your bones. After a while, Ray straightened, his jaw set. "We need to call Harlan." I nodded. "We do." We sat at the table, our paperwork still scattered everywhere. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had pulled closer. Ray dialed Harlan's number. I watched his hands tremble a little, but his voice stayed steady. When he explained that Mr. Thompson was willing to testify, swear it on record that he saw Daniel meeting with a Whitlock representative before the deed transfer, Harlan didn't speak at first. I heard silence on the phone, thick and thoughtful. Then he spoke. "That changes everything." My breath caught. Harlan continued. "If your neighbor is telling the truth and he's reliable, this isn't just manipulation. This is premeditated misrepresentation, maybe even fraud." The word hit the air like a bell. Fraud. A word heavy enough to push back the fear. I felt something tighten in my chest. Fear mixed with relief, mixed with a flicker of righteous anger I didn't know I still had at my age. "Harlan," I said, leaning closer to the phone, "what do we do now?" "You come to my office in the morning," he said. "Bring Mr. Thompson if you can. We'll prepare an injunction to stop the sale from closing." "An injunction?" Ray asked. "Think of it like a roadblock," Harlan said. "If the court approves, it freezes everything. No sale, no transfer of money, no bulldozers on your land." I closed my eyes and breathed out a shaky breath. "Thank God!" "But," Harlan added, "you must act fast. Whitlock closes deals quickly. If they file paperwork before we do, this becomes a war you won't win." The words chilled me. A race. We were in a race now. After the call ended, Ray slumped into his chair and covered his face. He stayed that way for a long moment. I watched him, seeing the man I'd loved for 52 years, fighting to hold himself together. Finally, he lowered his hands. His eyes were wet, but steady. "We're doing this," he said. I nodded. "We are." We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the meeting. I organized documents by year, labeling them with sticky notes. Ray wrote a summary of the last few months. We tried to think of anything, any detail that might help our case. As evening settled in, I heard a creak of a screen door. I peeked out the window expecting Mr. Thompson again. Instead, it was someone else. It was Emma. Sweet Emma, our neighbor from 3 houses down, the woman who used to bring us pies every Thanksgiving. Her hair was tucked under a scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cool wind. She waved at me through the window, holding a small notebook to her chest. When I opened the door, she didn't waste time. "Mae, I heard rumors," her voice trembled. "Is it true that Daniel's selling the farm?" I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. Emma stepped inside and sat down without asking. She placed the notebook on the table. "I didn't want to say anything before because I wasn't entirely sure, but I think I can help." Ray looked up. "Help how?" Emma opened the notebook slowly, carefully, like she was revealing something fragile. Inside were pages of notes, dates, times, observations. She pointed to a line from early spring. 2 months before you signed the deed," she said, "I saw Daniel parked near the northern field with a man in a black SUV. They were looking at soil samples. At first, I thought he was working for you two, but something didn't feel right." I leaned closer. "Did they see you?" "No," she said. "I was walking Rocky. He wandered close, so I called him back. They didn't notice me." Ray's voice grew soft. "You wrote it down?" She said. "I write everything down," half smiling. "It helps me remember what's happening around the neighborhood. But this looks bad, Mae. Real bad." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you." She squeezed back. "You and Ray are good people. You don't deserve this mess." Ray lifted the notebook carefully, treating it like evidence. "Harlan will want this." Emma nodded. "Then take it. I can come to court if needed." My eyes warmed. "You'd do that for us?" "Of course," she said. "We're neighbors, friends. And that land is part of this community. Losing it to a developer would break all our hearts. She stayed a little longer, drinking tea and talking with us about small things: weather, church gatherings, memories from summers past. Her presence brought comfort, grounding us like familiar soil beneath tired feet. After she left, Ray turned to me. "We have 2 witnesses now, good, honest people." I nodded. "And solid evidence." He exhaled deeply. "Then we have a fighting chance." Night grew quiet around us. The fields outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. I sat by the window watching the shadows stretch across the land. The same land that carried our footprints, our sweat, our marriage, our joys and sorrows. Every inch of it held a piece of us. I whispered to the dark fields, "I'm not letting you go. Even if it hurt, even if it scared me, even if Daniel came back angry, even if Whitlock threatened us, I wasn't letting go." A sudden sound outside pulled me from my thoughts. A car engine, slow, close. Ray peeked out from the bedroom. "Who's here this late?" I stepped outside, heart thumping. A small sedan sat at the bottom of our driveway, headlights off, engine humming. My breath tightened. Then the door opened and someone stepped out. A silhouette, tall, familiar, moving with the same careless swagger I'd watched since he was a boy. Daniel. He closed the door and stood there in the dark, staring up at the house like he wasn't sure whether to approach or run. Ray stepped behind me, his hand warm on my shoulder. Daniel shoved his hands in his pockets and called out softly, "Aunt May, we need to talk." But the tone in his voice, cold and careful, told me one thing clearly. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here because he knew we were coming for him, and he was scared. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the clock tap its way around the room. I kept thinking about the woman at the funeral, the way she stood so close to the casket, like she owned a piece of him. When the knock came again, softer this time, I felt my breath catch. It was her, standing on my porch with her hair pulled back tight and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said my husband promised her things. She said she had paperwork to prove she was family. I felt something cold move through me. I asked her who she really was. She didn't answer. She pushed a folded set of papers into my hand and walked away like she already knew what they said. My fingers shook as I opened them. My husband's name was there, and beside it, a signature I had never seen in my life. The next morning, the sun spilled golden light across the fields, but I barely noticed. My mind was tangled in knots, flipping through the papers the mysterious woman had left behind. Every signature, every line felt like a trap. Ray sat beside me quietly, holding his coffee, staring out at the barn as if it could shield us from the storm ahead. "We can't just ignore this," he said finally. "She says she's family. What if she's telling the truth?" I shook my head. "No, Ray, she's trying to scare us. This is the same strategy Daniel used. Intimidation. We know our land, we know the farm, and we know our own hearts." I gathered every receipt, every tax record, every note we'd kept for decades. They were more than just papers. They were proof. Proof that this land belonged to us, that Daniel had no right to sell it, and that this woman was nothing more than a distraction meant to weaken our resolve. Ray leaned over and pointed to one folder. "Start with the oldest documents, work forward, line them up, make a trail they can't ignore." I nodded. Slowly, methodically, we went through them. There were notes about planting seasons, barn repairs, tractor maintenance, deliveries of feed. Each one told a story of our life here. Each one reminded me that this was more than dirt and crops. It was our legacy. By mid-afternoon, I had created stacks that almost reached my chest. Ray leaned back, rubbing his face. "May, this is overwhelming." "It is," I admitted, my voice soft. "But if we don't do it, no one else will. This land is ours. We can't let fear take it from us." Just then the phone rang. It was Mr. Thompson. "I thought you'd like to know," he said. "I saw Daniel leaving town this morning. Not for work, not for a visit, he was heading toward the county line. He's probably trying to meet with that Whitlock developer before anyone can stop him. A shiver ran through me, but it wasn't fear, it was determination. I set the phone down and looked at Ray. We move now, gather the neighbors, gather witnesses. We're going to stop this sale. Ray nodded and we stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The fields stretched before us like a promise, golden and strong. I felt a surge of courage. Daniel thought he could manipulate, deceive, and disappear with our lives in his hands. He didn't know we were stronger than that. That evening, we began knocking on doors, talking quietly with neighbors we trusted. Each conversation was careful, each witness accounted for. Some remembered seeing Daniel with the developer before the deed was signed. Others remembered our years of work on the farm, noting that we had never relinquished control in practice, only on paper. By nightfall, we had a small army of people willing to testify, to back our claim, and to remind the court that a farm is not just a piece of property, it's the labor, love, and history poured into it over decades. I returned home, exhausted but resolute. The papers were stacked neatly on the kitchen table. Ray was asleep in his chair, one hand resting on a folder. I looked out the window at the barn, the fence, the rows of crops glowing faintly in the moonlight. No one could take this from us without a fight, and we were ready to fight.
The next morning, I woke before the sun. The farm was quiet, almost sacred in that early light, and I moved through it like someone tiptoeing on fragile ground. Ray was already up, walking the fence line as he always did, inspecting the posts and gates. But today he looked sharper, more alert. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the past few weeks of fear and betrayal had condensed into this moment, waiting for us to act. I sat at the kitchen table, laying out the stacks of documents and receipts we had collected. I had divided them by year, by type, by purpose. Taxes, utilities, crop records, machinery receipts, neighbor testimonies. Everything organized so that nothing could be dismissed as insignificant. I picked up one folder and ran my fingers over the edges of the papers. This land was our life, our blood, our sweat, and now it had to be defended like never before. Ray came in and set a thermos of coffee down beside me. His eyes were tired but steady. "Mae, we're going to do this," he said softly. "Together." I nodded. "We have to. I won't let them erase everything we built." The plan was simple but delicate. Harlan Beck would file the injunction to stop the sale, but for it to hold, we needed witnesses, documents, and a timeline that clearly showed Daniel acted with intent to deceive. That meant convincing neighbors to testify, tracking his meetings with Whitlock representatives, and proving the manipulation of the deed. Every small detail mattered. By mid-morning, Mr. Thompson arrived, followed by Emma. The three of us went over the notebook Emma had kept, cross-referencing dates, times, and sightings. It was meticulous work, but with every note, every name, I felt the weight of hopelessness lifting slightly. We weren't powerless. Not yet. "Look here," Emma said, pointing at a line in her notes. "April 12th. He was seen talking with the Whitlock man near the northern field." "That's before the deed was even signed," Ray muttered. His voice had that edge of disbelief that comes from realizing someone you trusted planned betrayal from the start. I nodded, my chest tightening. "Exactly. That's proof of intent. We can't lose this." The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls, errands, and quiet strategy sessions. By evening, I felt drained, but my mind was alive with determination. I walked the perimeter of the farm, touching the fence posts, looking over the crops, breathing in the smell of earth and hay. Every part of this land carried decades of work and love, and I wasn't letting go. That night, as we prepared to rest, a car pulled up to the driveway. It was Harlan. He came in without knocking, a folder under his arm. "I've prepared the injunction," he said. His eyes were sharp, professional. We'll need signatures and witness statements by tomorrow morning to present it at the county courthouse. Time is critical." I felt my heart race. Tomorrow. It felt like the culmination of weeks of fear, betrayal, and small victories. "We're ready," I said firmly. "We have the evidence, the witnesses, everything." Harlan nodded. "Good. I'll handle the legal side, but you two will need to testify. Make sure your accounts are clear, precise, and honest. The court doesn't care about anger, it cares about facts." Ray and I exchanged a glance. Honest. Facts. That's all we had to give, and it was enough. After Harlan left, I sat by the window staring at the fields. The moonlight reflected off the dew like tiny diamonds scattered across the rows. I thought about the woman who had tried to scare us, about Daniel's betrayal, about every moment that led us here. A quiet rage mingled with hope in my chest. We were ready to face him, to face the lies, to reclaim what was ours. As I drifted to sleep that night, I imagined the court, the papers in neat stacks, the neighbors' faces, the truth laid bare. And I promised myself one thing. No matter what threats or tricks Daniel tried next, he would not walk away with our farm. Because this land wasn't just soil and fences, it was the story of us, and we weren't finished telling it. Morning came crisp and quiet, the kind of early light that stretches shadows across the fields like long, soft fingers. I walked outside before Ray, letting the cold touch my face, letting it wake every sense. The barn smelled of hay and earth, the fences glistened from the dew, and the rows of crops seemed to whisper that they had been waiting for us to act. I felt a small swell of pride and fear at the same time. This was our farm, and soon it could be threatened by people who didn't care about sweat, love, or decades of life lived in these fields. Ray joined me shortly after, coffee in hand. He stood silently beside me, leaning on the railing of the porch, watching the horizon. "You ready for today?" he asked. I nodded, tightening my shawl around my shoulders. "We have to be. This is it. Everything we've prepared. Every receipt, every witness, every note, it all comes together today." We drove into town, the truck bumping along the familiar dirt roads, carrying us toward the courthouse where our lives might shift in a matter of hours. I gripped the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline, my knuckles white. Ray reached over, brushing my hand with his, a quiet reassurance that we were in this together. Harlan met us at the courthouse. His folder was thick with papers, testimony drafts, and evidence. He didn't speak much, just led us to a small room where we could gather before the hearing. Mr. Thompson and Emma were already there, waiting. Seeing their faces brought a tiny relief, a reminder that we were not alone. Harlan began organizing everyone. "We'll present the evidence in chronological order, witness statements first, then the documentation of the deed manipulation, followed by tax receipts, crop records, and maintenance logs. Keep your statements clear, concise, and factual. No anger, no emotion, just truth." I nodded, repeating it in my mind like a mantra. Truth, the only weapon we had against deceit. When it was our turn, I stepped forward first. My hands trembled slightly as I held the folder of documents. But the moment I looked at the judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, I felt a calm settle over me. I began speaking, my voice steady but soft, telling the story of the farm, the years of care, the history embedded in every fence post and crop row. Ray followed, presenting details about the construction repairs, the crop schedules, and the taxes we had paid. Together, we formed a tapestry of evidence showing not just ownership on paper, but continuous occupation and care. Then Harlan called on Mr. Thompson. The neighbor stepped forward, firm and clear. "I saw Daniel meeting with Whitlock representatives before the deed transfer. He intended to sell the farm before Aunt Mae and Uncle Ray even signed the papers." His voice was calm, unwavering. "I swear this to be true." Emma testified next, reading from her notebook. Each date,
Each observation confirmed the timeline of Daniel's premeditated actions. She described him meeting the developer, making arrangements, and pretending to act in our best interest. Her words were precise and factual, every page a thread in the case we had woven together. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom was heavy with quiet anticipation. Harlan presented the final documents, the 2 versions of the deed, our financial records, tax receipts, and maintenance logs. The judge examined each one carefully, her expression unreadable. Every glance from her sent my stomach into knots, but I kept my eyes fixed on the truth of the documents, letting them speak louder than fear. Finally, she spoke. "I will review the injunction request and all supporting evidence. A decision will be made shortly. Court is adjourned for today." We left the courthouse with a mixture of exhaustion and tentative relief. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like we had a real chance. Ray drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel, while I stared out the window at the streets of Willow Creek. The town seemed unchanged, ordinary, but I knew the shadows behind familiar faces held the secrets we were now uncovering. Back at the farm, the fields glowed in the late sunlight. I walked slowly along the northern fence line, imagining Daniel and Whitlock there, talking, plotting. I traced my hand along the worn wood of the posts, letting the roughness remind me of decades of work, sweat, and love. This land was ours, and it would remain ours. I whispered a quiet promise to the fields, the barn, the soil. I won't let you go. That evening, I began planting seeds in a small patch near the old oak tree at the edge of the field. It was symbolic, a reminder that life continues even after betrayal, even after fear. Each seed felt like hope, a small act of defiance. Ray helped, handing me the tools and digging shallow rows. We worked quietly, letting the rhythm of planting soothe the tension that had gripped us for weeks. As darkness fell, we stood back and looked at the neat rows, the soil turned carefully, the small beginnings of life taking shape. The farm was still ours, not just because of law, but because we cared, because we remembered, because we fought. And that mattered more than any piece of paper Daniel had tried to use against us. We went inside, the warm glow of the kitchen lights welcoming us back. I poured tea, letting the steam rise and settle in the cool night air. Ray and I sat together in silence, exhausted but determined. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a quiet reassurance. We weren't finished. The fight wasn't over, but we were ready for whatever came next. Somewhere deep in my chest, a steady, stubborn hope had taken root, like the seeds we had just planted. And I knew, no matter what happened in the courtroom tomorrow, we had already begun reclaiming what was ours. Morning arrived soft and pale, the kind of light that makes the dew on the crops sparkle like tiny stars. I walked out to the barn, the air crisp in my lungs, feeling every step on the familiar soil beneath my boots. Ray followed, carrying a thermos of coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to appear from the distance. Harlan had called early, telling us that the judge would review the injunction that morning. Every tick of the clock felt heavier than the last. We had prepared as best we could, receipts, neighbor testimonies, and careful records, but the thought of Daniel scheming behind the scenes kept my stomach in knots. By mid-morning, the phone rang again. Harlan's voice was steady, firm. "Mae, Ray, the injunction has been granted. The sale is frozen immediately. No funds can be transferred, and Whitlock cannot touch the property until further notice." I felt my knees weaken and pressed my hand to the kitchen counter. Ray wrapped an arm around my shoulders, holding me close, his own face wet with relief. "We did it," he whispered. "No," I said softly, tears pricking my eyes. "We didn't do it yet. We just stopped them for now. We have to make sure Daniel can't undo this." Harlan agreed. "This is just the first step. He can appeal and Whitlock can push back, but with the witnesses and documentation you've provided, the court is on your side." We spent the rest of the morning organizing everyone. Mr. Thompson and Emma were ready to testify in court if necessary. We drafted statements, double-checked dates, and made sure every detail lined up perfectly. Every year, every repair, every harvest was documented to show continuous care and rightful ownership. Around noon, a knock came at the door. My heart jumped. I opened it cautiously. There was Daniel, standing there with that same arrogant posture he had worn for as long as I could remember. Behind him, a sleek black car waited, unmistakably belonging to Whitlock. "Mae, Ray," he said smoothly, stepping onto the porch. "Can we be reasonable?" I narrowed my eyes. "Reasonable? You sold our farm without telling us. You lied. You manipulated. Reasonable isn't in your vocabulary." Ray stepped forward, his presence calm but firm. "You've already crossed the line, Daniel. The court's involved now. Any threats, any more deceit will be on you." He smirked, but there was an edge to it, a hint of worry. "We could work something out, maybe a compromise." I laughed, bitterly but controlled. "The only compromise we're interested in is the truth, and you returning what isn't yours to sell." Daniel's eyes flicked toward the black car. He shifted his weight, clearly calculating. I realized then that he had underestimated how determined we were. He didn't see the years of work, the sweat, the love embedded in every fence post, every row of crops. He didn't know that we weren't just going to let go quietly. By afternoon, Harlan arrived, papers in hand, and we filed the injunction officially. The court clerk stamped them, sealing our temporary victory. The relief was palpable, but I kept my voice steady. This wasn't the end, it was a checkpoint, a pause in the storm. That evening, back at the farm, I walked along the rows we had just planted. The tiny seedlings broke through the soil like little promises. Ray stood beside me, watching the horizon. "We're not done yet," he said. "No," I agreed, "but we've shown we won't back down. That counts for something." The night was quiet except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. Somewhere deep in the barn, the old wood groaned, reminding me of the years it had stood against storms and seasons. I leaned my hand against a post, feeling the familiar roughness. The farm was ours, not just because of law, but because it carried our lives, our history, our heart. Daniel could try everything, manipulations, threats, schemes, but he could not erase the work, the memories, and the care we had poured into this land. And as I watched the seedlings in the fading light, I felt a stubborn, steady hope grow in me. We would fight. We would protect our farm, and we would endure. Because this land was more than property. It was life. It was history. It was home. The morning air was brisk and smelled of wet soil and grass, and I felt a quiet determination as I stepped outside. Ray was already at the barn, inspecting the tools and equipment, muttering under his breath about the weeks of preparation ahead. We knew Daniel wouldn't give up easily. He had underestimated us once, but this time, he would learn we weren't the same as before. Harlan called early to confirm the hearing for the next day. He sounded confident, but even he admitted this wasn't going to be simple. Whitlock had deep pockets, and Daniel had connections. Every move we made had to be careful, precise, and documented. One misstep could undo everything. I spent the morning going through the receipts and documents again, making sure every detail aligned with Emma's notebook and Mr. Thompson's testimony. I highlighted dates, added notes about repairs, planting, and taxes. It felt like weaving a safety net. Every thread, every stitch meant a chance to hold our farm together. Around mid-morning, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Turner carrying a basket of pies and a worried look. "I heard about the injunction," she said softly. "I wanted to bring something for you and Ray, and to say you're not alone in this." Her kindness warmed me, reminding me that the fight wasn't just ours. The neighbors we had grown up with, who had watched our family through storms and harvests, were on our side. She stayed a while, listening as I explained the steps ahead and promising that we would keep everyone updated. By afternoon, Ray and I had mapped out our plan for the courthouse. We rehearsed what to say, the order in which evidence would be presented, and how witnesses would respond. Each rehearsal made us a little steadier, a little stronger. As evening fell, I walked through the fields, letting my fingers trail along the rows we had recently planted. The seedlings were fragile, but they reminded me that growth is slow, persistent, and requires care, just like fighting for something you love. Ray joined me, and we stood together in silence, the cool wind carrying the faint scent of earth and promise. Later, as we returned to the house, I caught sight of Daniel's car parked at the edge of the property, partially hidden by trees. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. He was watching, waiting, perhaps hoping we would falter, but we wouldn't, not this time. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. I dreamed of the farm being stripped away, of bulldozers leveling the barn, the crops trampled. I woke to the sound of howl owls and the wind in the trees, heart still pounding. Ray stirred beside me, murmuring my name. I whispered back that everything would be all right. The next morning, we drove into town early, arriving at the courthouse before the sun fully rose. The air was cold but clear, the streets quiet, giving us a moment to steel ourselves. Harlan met us at the steps, briefcase in hand, and gave a small nod. "Ready?" he asked. I took Ray's hand and nodded. Ready. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and old books. The judge was already seated, reviewing documents. We took our seats, the weight of the last few weeks pressing against our shoulders, but bolstered by preparation, evidence, and unwavering resolve. When it was our turn, I presented the records first, letting the papers speak for themselves. The receipts, tax records, and notes that proved decades of ownership and care. Ray followed, describing maintenance, planting, and the day-to-day stewardship of the farm. Each word, each document built a story that no paper signature or empty promise could erase. Mr. Thompson and Emma testified next, recounting the meetings and observations that showed Daniel's intent to sell before the deed transfer. Their voices were calm but firm, filling the room with clarity and truth. Daniel and his lawyer tried to argue, to claim misunderstanding, to point at technicalities, but the layers of evidence and witnesses created a wall they could not breach. Every falsehood crumbled against the weight of decades of work, witness testimony, and careful documentation. By mid-afternoon, the hearing adjourned. The judge promised a decision soon, taking all evidence under careful consideration. We left the courthouse tired but steady, the autumn sun casting long, hopeful shadows over the town. Back at the farm, I walked along the rows again, brushing my hands across the seedlings. "We've done everything we can," I whispered to the fields, the barn, and the fence posts. "Now we wait." Ray stood beside me, hand resting on mine. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together, and this time we won't let anyone take what's ours." I nodded, letting the wind carry my vow. The farm was more than land. It was memory, life, and love, and no one, not Daniel, not Whitlock, could ever erase that. The following morning, the air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and the first hints of winter frost. Ray and I walked along the fence line together, each step deliberate, every post a reminder of decades spent tending this land. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, but it was tempered by resolve. The court's decision was coming soon, and we had done everything we could to protect our home. Harlan arrived mid-morning, his briefcase heavy with papers. He didn't need to speak much. The look on his face told me everything. "Mae, Ray, the judge is reviewing all evidence. They've acknowledged the witnesses, the documentation, and the premeditated intent. Your chances are very strong." I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders relax just a fraction. "Strong enough?" I asked, my voice soft. "Strong enough to win," Harlan said. Now it's just about timing. The injunction is already in place, which buys us more leverage. Daniel can't sell, can't interfere until the court fully rules. I felt a flicker of hope that warmed the cold morning air. Ray squeezed my hand. Finally, the fight might be over. We spent the day preparing the last details, arranging witnesses, organizing documents, and double-checking everything that might come up. Neighbors dropped by quietly, offering support and small comforts, pies, hot cider, and kind words that reminded me we weren't alone. Emma and Mr. Thompson were steady, calm, and resolute. Their presence was a reminder that our community stood with us, that this land meant more than just property. It carried history and shared care. As evening fell, I walked along the northern field, watching the last sunlight glint across the crops. The shadows of trees stretched long, and the wind carried the faint smell of harvest and earth. I thought about Daniel, how he had planned, how he had betrayed us, and how he had underestimated the strength of a couple who had spent decades building a life together. That night, sleep was restless, but I felt ready. The court's decision could come any day, and I was prepared to stand firm, to speak clearly, to let the truth of our lives and work shine. The morning light spilled across the farm like a gentle blessing. The fields glistened with dew, the fence posts casting long shadows across the rows of crops. I stood at the porch, Ray beside me, listening to the soft stirrings of the land, the distant crow of a rooster, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind over the soil. It felt like the farm itself was holding its breath. Then the phone rang. Harlan's voice was calm but carried a note of triumph. "Mae? Ray, the judge has ruled. The injunction is confirmed and the deed remains in your names. Daniel's attempts to transfer or sell the property are null and void. Your farm is yours, completely." I sank into the porch chair, hands trembling. Tears rolled down my cheeks, warm and liberating. Ray pulled me close, holding me as if the relief itself needed protection. "We did it," he whispered. "No," I said softly, my voice catching. "We didn't just stop him. We reclaimed what's ours." Harlan visited later in the day to finalize the paperwork, confirming the permanent protection of the farm. We signed documents, witnessed statements, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a deep sense of closure. Daniel's threats, his schemes, his manipulations, they were finally powerless against truth, community, and persistence. That evening, I walked along the northern field, the place where Daniel had once plotted and whispered with Whitlock representatives. I knelt and dug a small hole near the old oak tree, planting a young sapling. "For resilience," I whispered, pressing the soil around it. "For hope. For all the battles fought quietly, and for those still ahead." Ray stood behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "It's perfect," he said softly, "just like us." The neighbors came by that weekend, celebrating in small, quiet ways. Emma brought flowers, Mr. Thompson shared a story about the first harvest he remembered here, and even Mrs. Turner stopped by with a pie for us to share. We laughed softly, remembering years past, and I realized something important. Victory was not just about winning in court. It was about the people who stood with us, the land that held our history, and the knowledge that truth, patience, and courage could overcome betrayal. At dusk, I walked the length of the farm, the golden light reflecting off the crops, the barns sturdy and silent, the fences strong and steady. I thought about the past weeks, the fear, the sleepless nights, the tension, and I knew we had grown stronger because of it. Daniel had tried to take more than land. He had tried to shake our sense of worth, our place in the community, but he had failed. As night fell and the stars began to shimmer, I stood beneath the oak tree, the young sapling at its side. I whispered a quiet promise into the wind. "This farm will live on, our legacy will endure, and no one will ever take it from us again." Ray came up behind me, and together we watched the moonlight dance across the fields. The farm was ours. The fight was over, and a new chapter had begun. A chapter of peace, resilience, and quiet joy. In that moment, I understood something deeply. The land is more than soil and crops. It is memory, love, and life itself. And with care, courage, and determination, it can survive betrayal, greed, and deceit. Our farm was more than a piece of property. It was home, and home, finally, was safe again.